I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflection on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Duckworth Library at Young Harris College and the Richard B. Russell Library for Research and Studies at the University of Georgia. Our guest is State Representative McCracken Poston. Welcome. We're delighted to have you on our series. Thank you.
I'm honored to be asked.
With your permission, we'd like to divide our conversation into three parts. First, you and your early life. Secondly, your experiences as a public servant. And lastly, your work as an attorney who's handled many high-profile cases here in Georgia. Ringgold, Georgia.
Yes, sir, in the county seat of Catoosa County. But I actually grew up in a much smaller town north of Ringgold, Graysville, Georgia. And Graysville, I think in its heyday, had 120 people in it. The great thing about Graysville was, as a child, my mother was a poll worker, and we had a little cinder block polling place that was in the end of a dog pen. Luckily, you didn't have to go through the dog pen, but it was kind of built into the end of it. And I remember as a child, having to stay there all day while my mother was a poll worker, just how it was the most excitement that ever happened in Graysville, because you saw people you didn't see for a long time, and you saw candidates leading up to that time that you never saw. And it became a real big deal to me to try to help, and then later I was enthusiastic about getting involved in elections. I had been born over in Fort Oglethorpe, and but I was raised in Graysville all of my life. And I remember as I got older and old enough to get involved in campaigns, and my oldest sisters, I have 5 older sisters, and I'm very proud of all of them. And some of them accomplished some great things really before women were encouraged to go to school and be anything other than this, that, and the other, and they've done well. But a couple of my oldest sisters were involved in the Kennedy campaigns in college, and that kind of rubbed off on me a little bit. But I decided that every candidate that I could find that was worth his or her salt was going to come visit Graysville, Georgia. And we had a little mercantile store in the middle of town with 2 real characters that ran the place, Pete and Bud Brown. They were World War II vets, brothers who ran a great little butcher shop and a little general store. And I made it my cause to bring in candidates because it was a great setting for a candidate. Chattanooga was just across the line. The news crews could come from Chattanooga and be there very quickly. It gave them a real kind of an old world setting for a political event. And the first candidate of any kind of broad election that I took there was Norman Underwood. And really worked hard on Norman Underwood's campaign. He was a North Georgia man, being from Calhoun. And so I thought he was a good candidate for governor that year, and I think it was 82. And later on, I went on to law school, and I'd like to give Norman Underwood credit probably for helping me get into law school just here in Athens. And during law school, I got a call from Norman Underwood after my congressman was shot down somewhere over Korea or Japan in the Korean Airlines incident.
Larry McDonald.
And I was no big fan of Larry McDonald, but that was a terrible way to go. And but it did create an opportunity for the 7th District, and that's where Catoosa County was configured then. And I heard for the first time about a man named Buddy Darden. And Norman Underwood had told me some nice things about him, and apparently told Buddy Darden some things about me and how I'd worked hard for him up in Catoosa County. So I decided I would take Buddy Darden to the Graysville store, and among other places all through Catoosa and Walker and Dade counties, and just really hit up a good friendship with Buddy Darden that lasts to this day, and later worked for him in Washington as an intern. But Buddy really enjoyed the Graysville store, and I learned something about the Graysville store. I had been just kind of, the brothers there at the store would really give what I called the treatment to a candidate. They would not hold anything back, but it was always good-natured kind of teasing, but it had kind of an edge to it as well. And I remember when I worked for Buddy, and I would see at the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol, there was a room that you go into the top of the Capitol, and they'd run a flag up the pole, and then they'd run it down, and then you'd get a certificate that on that day that flag flew above the Capitol. Even if it flew up there for just a second, technically it flew above the Capitol. So I, in my powers of an intern, got behind the typewriter and wrote up a kind of a proclamation and a letter that I got Buddy Darden to sign to the Brown brothers, and commemorating just this piece of Americana that they had at the store. And I just thought they'd get a big laugh out of it, and I packaged up the flag, and my mother at the time was the assistant postmaster in Graysville, so I just sent it general delivery and asked her if she'd make sure Pete and Bud got it. What I guess I didn't expect, these were two World War II veterans that had fought for our country, the emotional impact it had on them. It was almost in jest from me, but when I heard their reaction when they got it, it was a flag that had actually flown over the U.S. Capitol, I was profoundly touched, because I realized these people still do believe in the system. They still do believe in our country, and anyway, as touched as they were, I was touched by their reaction. Well, later, a couple of years later, a gentleman that I had always kind of admired, Hamilton Jordan, decided he was going to run for U.S. Senate. And much like the same people kind of tell about this young guy in North Georgia that'll work hard for you, he found me. And I remember we were having an event for him in '86, and there was kind of an entourage following him. I really didn't know who it was, but I had worked out the schedule that day. And without telling anybody, I built in about a 2-hour period for travel from the Walker County event through Catoosa County, and I was going to take him to the Graysville store before I took him to the airport in Chattanooga. And there was just really nothing good happening. There was nothing really newsworthy happening. And I had heard that there were some news reporters behind him in that car. So I said, well, I've built in another stop, Hamilton. It's a little place that I think will be a good setting for your news crews, and you just never know what happens here. And he said, are you taking me to the Graysville store? And I was just completely overwhelmed. I thought, you've heard of it? He said, Buddy Darden said you'd drag me to this place. Well, we went, and he got out, and Pete and Bud Brown, who were never scripted, Pete pulled a gun on him and waved it around in his face and said, now are you one of these Republicans? Because if you are, we're going to throw you in the creek and let them fish you out in Tennessee. And so they had a big time with Hamilton. Well, as soon as that gun came out, I saw reporters' notepads flip open and a photographer's flashes start going off. One of the reporters was David Broder of the Washington Post, and who I'd been reading for years, but I never recognized him. He was in a baseball cap and a T-shirt, and he did an article in the Washington Post, Dateline Graysville, Georgia. And I guarantee, since the Civil War, nothing has datelined Graysville, Georgia. But it turned out to be a very good article, and so Hamilton was glad that I had kind of worked that in there, a place that he wasn't sure if I should drag him there or not. But I felt confident after running those three gentlemen's races locally, where Norman won Catoosa County, Buddy won Catoosa County, and Hamilton even won Catoosa County, that it was time for me to run. By then I was out of law school. I was an assistant district attorney with hopeful ambitions to go to the state legislature. My legislator was Bob Peters, who had been there for 20 years and who I was very good friends with his daughter in school. I didn't have a thing in the world against Bob, but it was something that would run into me many years later, a young person trying to challenge a way, and I was in my 20s. I was 27 when I started the race. Basically just saying it's our turn. Nothing against you, it's just our turn. Well, things, I did a couple of things right, I think. One is I went and visited Tom Murphy, the Speaker of the House. Mm-hmm. Stuck my hand out and introduced myself, and I said, I just want you to know I'm not running against you. I'm just running for the seat. And, you know, I did that kind of as a preemptive way to not win the battle and lose the war. You know, I wanted to be well received. And I just worked hard. I had to quit my job as assistant DA. I didn't really have a law practice much developed, so I just worked every day. And I went door to door. I think somebody estimated once that I'd gone to about 5,000 or 6,000 doors. Got bit by a bunch of dogs, and those are the people that always
Kissed
remember
a lot
you.
of babies.
Yeah, when their dogs bite you and you don't complain, they like you. They will vote for you. I went to the primary and was surprised myself even. I beat Bob and I got 70% of the vote. Now that kind of set up a dilemma for me because this was 1988. I really liked those big numbers. I just knew that that would send a message with me to Atlanta that I may be there to stay a while. Mm-hmm. I had done my homework with the Speaker and the leadership, so they were impressed with that number. But we had a bit of a fledgling Republican Party that was starting up there, and they had fielded a candidate. So I knew at the top of my ticket it was going to be Mike Dukakis versus George H.W. Bush. And I knew I was not going to get 70% of the vote because my county was already voting Republican in a lot of national races, and where they weren't yet in the state races. We just knew it was coming. So I didn't know what to do. I just kept working hard. The fellow that was running as a Republican was the county surveyor. And I just remember one day in court, I did have a couple of little cases that I just did to keep food on the table and keep gas in the car. I went back and I did just my first attempt at opposition research. I just literally, without any kind of hint that there would be anything there, started going through the old giant books of cases that had been gone back for many years, all alphabetized. In other words, everybody with the last name C would be in this one book, and then you could go to the older book that had the last name C. Well, lo and behold, about 27, 28 years before, or 23 years, I think, before, there was a conviction by my Republican opponent for attempted murder. And so I knew enough about voter registration that if you were a convicted felon, you could not only not hold office, you couldn't vote unless your civil rights were restored. Mm-hmm. Well, I really went back and forth. I wasn't sure whether that was really him, had the same name, same middle initial. The way indictments were drawn in those days were pretty interesting because it didn't use any kind of standardized language. It used some pretty flowery language describing actually what the state alleged happened. And they said he had stabbed a guy with a dirk. Well, I'd never heard of a dirk. I had to look it up. And so I just hesitantly, Max Cleland was coming to Chattanooga to give a speech, and I went up there and introduced myself, and I told him, I said, you know, I'm running in this race, and I know you're the superintendent of elections. I've got this situation. I don't know what to do about it. I described it to him, and he said, well, we can investigate it if you want to. So I thought long and hard, and I really thought about wanting to come down to Atlanta with that 70%. And I went ahead and filed for an investigation of it. Well, I thought all along, I've messed up. This is probably his father. This is probably somebody that's not even him. And next thing you know, my opponent's holding a press conference. And I thought, that's pretty bold. It must be that I have screwed up. And I got the wrong guy. They flipped on the camera, and he goes to the microphone, and he said, first place, I wish you people would quit using that word dirk. I cut that boy with a regular pocket knife. So I knew I was in good shape, and I got to go to the Capitol with my 70% intact, and it immediately paid off. Speaker, I guess, really did show me a lot of graciousness and a lot of inclusiveness, which, of course, later, I guess, made some of my later positions hurt even the more to him, and I always felt bad about that. But it was an interesting thing, because the actual first event that I ever went to as an elected representative-elect was I was invited to a freshman gathering. Didn't really know much about it, but it was the first opportunity I was going to have to meet my freshman colleagues. This was late 1988, maybe November, maybe about this time of year, 1988. But I was to show up at the Ritz-Carlton in Atlanta. And I showed up, and there were some people that I had known for a few years through Young Democrats or other connections, but later ended up being lifelong friends. One, Ron Fennell from the coast, who was just a good candidate and a very aggressive and on the move kind of guy. Another, Ray Holland, whose brother was a friend of mine from law school, whose brother John, who's now a judge down in Turner County. Ray is a few years older, very interesting guy, very intellectual guy. And then my friend Doug Tieper, who was one of the, at the time, maybe the only Jewish member of the legislature, had kind of had a life of political activism. He and I roomed together at the event in Athens where the entire legislature meets before the legislature starts, and kind of it's an orientation of sorts. Doug and I roomed together, and he's telling me all these protests he had done and all these nuclear plants he had protested, and I just remember laying in bed thinking, oh Lord, this guy's a real Molotov cocktail thrower. I don't know about this guy, but ended up he became really one of my best friends in life. You became known as the Four Horsemen. Those four, we did. Right. We did. Only because we stuck together. I guess we were all four kind of taken in by the speaker. And, the speaker had a very interesting style that probably was very effective. You never heard the speaker directly say, I don't like this, I don't like that, or I don't want this happening, or I don't want that happening. He would issue some vague kind of opinions that everybody surrounding him kind of knew what the gist of it was, and then everybody else would do his bidding. Well, in our case, he was just inclusive of us, and really more so of some of our colleagues, which had to not be pleasant for them. And the poor Republicans didn't even get the time of day. Earl Earhart was in my class, his first time in the legislature. Cynthia McKinney, Ralph David Abernathy III, several other really good people who got elected and but did not have that immediate inclusiveness that the four of us did.
How did you get that name, Four Horsemen?
I have no idea. One of the, I always associate it with the apocalypse, so I'm not sure maybe that was appropriate. But I don't know. I know one of the newspaper articles had something to do with it. And I got to tell you, and I think the speaker was behind this. I got selected to be profiled by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution as a freshman. And I don't think that happened. I don't think they just picked me because I was like everybody else had ever been in the legislature, white, male. I think that was a direction maybe Murphy offered me up for that, which he most certainly later regretted. But I, it was flattering, and I remember my friends Ron, Ray, and Doug. We would try to include each other on things if we heard about them. But the interesting thing about my freshman year, we were told to be quiet and, be seen and not heard. There was something very interesting that was going on at the Capitol that I think people innocently get sucked into. For one thing, I told you about the going to the Ritz-Carlton and going to the races the next day. Well, that kind of rarefied air at the Capitol can be somewhat intoxicating. And I saw a lot of people become somewhat dependent on that. I knew of a committee chairman that loved to eat at the Commerce Club. And so someone took him every day to the Commerce Club. Now, I often thought, well, what if that person that took him to the Commerce Club decided they really needed a bill through? And this guy's got how many years of service and how many lunches at the Commerce Club? The popular saying is you can't buy a legislator for a lunch. But, let's say about 30 years of lunches at the Commerce Club. There's no telling what the value of that is. And that might be something that legislator thinks about. We got invited to the Masters. It was just seemed to be a real a time of where your head would get pretty big if you weren't careful. My next term, I had decided myself that I needed to do some constituent service. 89 was my first session. 90 was my second session. So it really actually wasn't my next term, but it was election year. And I had about 3 issues in Catoosa County. One was a proposed toxic waste facility that nobody wanted except the person that had the license. The other one was an issue about, I tried to remember all this. Catoosa is one of the smallest geographic counties in the state, but we had 5 phone companies working in different parts of the counties. We had Bell South out of Chattanooga that actually came down into Graysville and got my parents and my house where I grew up. We had Ringgold Telephone Company based in Ringgold and spreading out. We had the Chickamauga Telephone Company. We had something out of Dalton, and I think we had one more. And it would be long distance to call just across the county. In some communities, it would be long distance to call across the road. And James Beck, who was a member of the legislature from South Georgia, he had a similar situation in his county. So he and I decided we're going to introduce a toll-free countywide calling bill to make phone companies work it out amongst themselves, but you got to be able to call across your county for free. Well, I put my name on the bill, and we dropped it in, and a lobbyist from the telephone communications industry came by and said, "We're going to miss you at the Masters this year." Well, I started figuring out how things worked around there, and it was a bit unsettling because you have an atmosphere where your ability to be places with your colleagues was important because that's where you, I guess, bonded and shared all your memories, and a lot of business was discussed on those kind of things. And yet I had a constituent issue. So finally, there was one other little guy. He was a sole operator of a little Exxon gas station. His name was Ken Abney, and it was in Ringgold, and he'd been there all his life. His family's big family in Lafayette and Ringgold. But Ken was a sole operator of his gas station, and he sold Exxon product. And he asked me one day while I was in there, he said, would you ever consider doing something for me? And I said, what? And he said, well, this Exxon is breaking me. They're selling to me at prices that their own company-owned store, they're undercutting to it. So that store just up the road is killing me, but I'm contractually obligated to them. And I vaguely started remembering a thing that as a freshman at the very first meeting I ever had with my colleagues, these oil lobbyists were talking about. And that was, don't ever introduce retail divorcement.
Divorcement.
Don't ever introduce it. That was the message at that meeting. Well, I didn't know what divorcement was, and it didn't sound like anything I would ever introduce. And here was a constituent asking me directly, would you help me? Can you help me keep them from doing this to me? So, kind of remembering the little comment about the masters, I decided, well, I'm going to try to be a constituent-minded person, and I'm going to be more careful. And so I drew up a bill. Well, it was later called in the 1991 session, it was called the Lobbyist Full Employment Act of 1991. Every lobbyist at the Capitol, and a lot they flew in, were hired by these companies. They came in, they completely overwhelmed the Capitol. Some of my colleagues who enjoyed that kind of thing were patting me on the back saying, we've never had it so good here. There were lunches and dinners and sports tickets and all kinds of things, going around. And here I was representing my sole constituent. The oil lobbyists actually had the audacity to come up and say, we can't believe you did this. This is just a little guy. He only sells so-and-so gallons a month. We've looked him up. We know what it's all about. And at that moment, that was the wrong thing to say to me. And so I really just kind of buckled in. But I realized that divorcement itself, I think there were good arguments on both sides, and I recognized that. So I told the side that liked what I did, I said, I'm only carrying this so far as it helps or affects my constituent. If you're going to start trying to protect this middlemen called the jobbers, you need to get another person to carry that water, because I'm just really going to limit it to what my constituent needs, and he's an owner-operator. And so that's ultimately what killed the bill. I think Tom Kilgore introduced a amendment on the House floor to include the jobbers, and I just didn't have the constituency in the jobbers. So I basically, was not necessarily for that amendment. It killed the bill. But the aftermath was amazing, because the Atlanta Business Chronicle quoted a member of the Petroleum Council of Georgia who said, we spent $800,000 to beat Poston's bill. Now, $800,000 in a house of 180 people, that just was phenomenal to me. And I think that was a low estimate. That's how much they spent. We don't know how much the individual oil companies spent. We don't know how much the jobbers spent trying to support my bill. We didn't know, because there was no registration of lobbyists. There was no reporting of their expenditures. There was nothing like that in Georgia. So one newspaper said that I was chagrined at the excesses that I had witnessed, and I think that was an understatement. What happened later that year, though, probably had more to do with my positions than anything. Was in July, I developed type 1 insulin-dependent diabetes. And it had been in my family. My youngest sister had it. But it changes you. At least I think, not just diabetes, any realization of mortality made a lot of the things that went on at the Capitol look kind of silly by comparison. And it sure made waiting in the wings and keeping quiet for 10 years seem silly. And I knew my district was changing so much that I knew the old pattern of do your apprenticeship, be quiet, do what the speaker tells you to, until your time comes. That just wasn't going to work. It was already changing. The Republicans were increasing in number in the House, even though then they were around 60-something members out of 180. But, you only had to have 91 to have the whole House. And so reapportionment was that year. I remember being in the hospital and having reapportionment maps tacked up on the wall in the hospital up in Chattanooga. And I was still respectful to Mr. Speaker. I remember a number of us had basically taken what he wanted his district to look like in Haralson County as number one, and then we drew what we could live with, and then we presented it to him as basically the entire congressional district of state House districts, and got him to sign off on it. Well, that's all we needed. Carry that map to reapportionment with his signature and all of our signatures on it. And everybody knew, okay, that's sacred. We're not going to mess with that district. So it kind of took care of reapportionment, which was always a critical time in any legislator's lives. So another thing kind of happened that I think affected me. When I was a freshman, I had been asked by the speaker. Again, he never asked directly, but one of his staffers had said, "Speaker, I'd like to spend some time with you this weekend. You got any plans?" And I said, "Well, I don't now. The speaker wants to spend time with me." So I was told to be at the bottom of the old Ramada, which was the Stadium Hotel at the time, where everybody tried to stay close to the speaker. And I thought, well, we're going to Bremen. I'm wondering what am I going to do in Bremen? What if I'm dressed appropriately? Well, we didn't go to Bremen. We went to Charlie Brown Airport. We got in a slick little airplane, and me and another legislator and the speaker and a lobbyist. And we went to Houston. I never, to this day, know what we were doing there. But I do know that when I got back, and I guess I was just literally going along for the ride. When we got back, the other 3 people in the plane with me were all named in the BCCI investigation that was going on, the Bank of Commerce Credit International, that rogue Italian bank that had influenced or tried to influence some banking legislation in Georgia before I even got there. And I don't know, I have no idea to think anything wrong was going on that trip, but I just knew it's all 3 of them plus me and some other trip. So with that and the diabetes and the things I'd witnessed in the retail divorcement bill, my heart was set. And I read that Max Cleland was going to do a blue ribbon commission on ethics in government. Now, Max was chomping at the bit for an office to run for. And so I realized that was his purpose. But what I don't think he realized was my intent. And I told him, I said, would you please put me on this panel, because I plan on introducing its results as a bill. Well, that kind of got Max excited, because the speaker didn't like Max Cleland. And I don't know of any particular reason, but he just wasn't one of the speaker's proteges. He wasn't like Bubba or a number of the other Larry or Terry or any of the other members that had been there toiling and waiting their turn. And so it was a bit of a disconcerting to the Speaker that I was helping Max Cleland with something. And I told him, I said, Mr. Speaker, I just really was upset by a lot of the things that I observed, and I really feel like we could use this. And that was very naive of me. I realize that now. And I don't think the Speaker was against ethical rules. I never want anybody to ever think that I was saying, well, he's unethical and I'm ethical. What I realized was that this was a very powerful tool that Tom Murphy had. As long as there were enough of us who loved going to the Masters and who loved going to the Commerce Club and who loved doing these things, he literally could control us that much easier. I mean, here was the tools that he was using very deftly to keep power, and quite easily, I might add, because few lobbyists were going to cross him. They had multiple clients. They would be hurting all their clients if they took a real controversial issue that the Speaker was against. So it was just a very well-oiled machine. And but I introduced the bill. Well, of course, Common Cause and some good government organizations kind of rallied around it, but they were not used to winning anything. they were used to tilting at windmills all the time and not having any success. So there was no formula or blueprint for success for anything like this. So, of course, I had mentioned that the Speaker had kind of helped me become this freshman that they had been profiling. Well, I was a sophomore now, but he had helped get my name out there. So the Atlanta Journal-Constitution started picking up on the bill. Hey, yeah, this is needed. What also helped was I was asked to debate the bill on Channel 5, and this was just before the '92 session. And so I went to debate the bill with a senator who, before I even had the bill introduced, between our debate and the introduction, he was federally indicted. So there would be things like jet fuel that would happen to my bill that I didn't cause, but certainly they were helping it along, the general feeling that we need to have ethics legislation. Mm-hmm. And so it started. Well, of course, the Speaker, in a very unfortunate interview for him, basically said he didn't see any need for ethics. And what the opponents always came down to is, I can't believe you're challenging my integrity. I can't be bought for a meal. Well, like I said, well, of course you can't. But if you really like golf, you may not introduce that bill for toll-free countywide calling because you like golf a lot and you sure think Augusta National is a pretty place. Or if you really like the Commerce Club, you might not let that bill out of your committee because that lobbyist is against it. And I realized suddenly, it became very clear to me how they played ball when I got a call from Rhonda Cook. And I had met a young woman and married her, a woman I met at the Capitol. And I got a call from Rhonda Cook, and she said, well, I can't tell you who told me, but somebody in the Speaker's office told me that you had accepted a gift from lobbyists for your wedding. And I said, well, I don't know. I don't think I did. But I'll get back to you. Let me just get back to you. I called my then new wife, and I said, let's go through those thank you cards and let's see who all gave everything, and tell me anybody that you know or recognize as a lobbyist. She was up in Ringgold. She called me back a little later, and she said, well, Larry Walker, Terry Coleman, Buddy Darden, about a dozen legislators had gone in together for a trip, a honeymoon trip. But John Thomas and Jake Cullens are on there too. I said, well, that's fine. That's good. And I called Rhonda back, and I said, well, they're right. And I said, and I think this is a good example of why we need ethics legislation, when they can get into your wedding gifts you think are from your colleagues, and you don't even know that they were there until, you look at the card. And so that was their swipe at me for doing this, and I just continued running, because it taught me a valuable lesson, though, about how they play ball. And so and I remembered that. So we get in with the bill, and like I said, I had 2 strikes against me. I was working against the Speaker's mandate that we didn't need an ethics bill, and I was working with Max Cleland, which of course, the Speaker always had his candidate for something, and I'd done the good lieutenant stuff. I had flown around with Bubba McDonald all over the state, and sometimes I was the only person flying around with him, because the Speaker wanted us to support Bubba, and probably missed out on a lot of good opportunities with Governor Miller because of doing what the Speaker asked me to do. So I was realizing what this was about to cost me. The Speaker did get interviewed because he introduced an ethics bill, or he had his people introduced an ethics bill, a companion ethics bill. And the paper, and by the way, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, people have to realize, then was a true statewide paper. Mm-hmm. It's no longer that anymore. It doesn't even run even here in Athens anymore on a daily basis, and it hasn't run in Ringgold for years, but at the time it did. You could get it literally statewide. And so here's a reporter asking him questions, which he rarely did. And one of the questions was, why is your bill speeding along and why is Poston's bill bogged down? And he said, well, I don't know. There's a vast difference between our 2 bills. And they said, well, what are the differences between the 2? What is the differences? What do you not like about Poston's bill? And he said, well, I don't know. I haven't read it. Mm-hmm. So there's a vast difference between our 2 bills, but he hasn't read mine. And that kind of helped me out a little bit from, unintentionally, of course. But the attempt to embarrass me was a definite shot across the bow, and a valuable lesson. Charlie Weltner, who was, of course, on our Supreme Court, and who had lived a life of taking very principled positions, even if it hurt his politics. I went to law school with his son, and I was friends with his daughter. And I would seek counsel from him sometimes in this new role that I had of trying to reform some things. And, I said, I just didn't know that they had gotten involved in my wedding even. And he said, you should have. He didn't offer any kind of condolences or don't worry about it or shaking it off. He just said, you should have. And that was a valuable thing to hear from him because I always respected him. So the AJC at the time, the Atlanta paper, started doing something that I thought was unprecedented. When my bill would stall in committee, they would do an excellent editorial, but then they would list the numbers of the committee members, and particularly the committee members who were obstructing. And so these people started getting hundreds, if not thousands, of telephone calls. Well, as impressive as that was, imagine how I was treated. Even by the secretaries, they were having to field these calls. It was not my idea and it was not my strategy, but it was effective because people were starting to get a little worried. They started getting calls from their own district. I can't believe you would obstruct something called an ethics bill. What is the point behind that? And I made it clear that while there were a lot in the bill that I could do without, my main interest was lobbyist registration and lobbyist disclosure. I've never been a term limits guy. I always thought voters could make up their own mind about their legislator if they had the information. What they were lacking was the information of what was influencing their legislator. And that's what the bill was offering. So at some point, probably in all of politics, perception becomes political reality. So I was being crucified a bit for championing this bill, and the Atlanta paper, every slight that would happen to me, the Atlanta paper would run it, and the other side would just get besieged by calls from their district, and that was fairly interesting. The paper would identify me as someone who was challenging leadership and that the leadership was unhappy, and it all really became red meat when I was pushing to fund the State Ethics Commission to manage these new rules, and the new Welcome Center in Ringgold got cut from the budget right as they found some money for the new ethics bill. So I took it in good stride. I thought, the Welcome Center, cutting that is really hurting all of you. It's not like cutting the McCracken Poston Health Center or anything that Catoosa Countyans go to. We never stop at the Welcome Center. But you're hurting yourself because this is your state, and this is where people come, a big corridor, I-75, and, you're really hurting yourself. But, touche. And so basically that gave the paper and the media the kind of the give and take, and they really ran with it. And this poor legislator, and how he's being beat up, and how they're hurting, they're not wanting his bill. Well, in committee, I learned a lot about the process because Denmark Groover was, of course, the mastermind and just an incredible lawyer. That they even created a verb out of his name. A bill would be grooverized, and you didn't always want your bill grooverized because sometimes everything you intended it for it to do, once it was grooverized, it did the exact opposite. But, you looked like you were passing a bill that did nothing. Well, I knew enough about that, and I was on judiciary, and to Speaker Murphy's credit, he had a system of rules where once you got a committee, he would not take you off of it, no matter how mad he got at you. Rules Committee was the only one he would take you off of, and so that was the one committee that he really controlled with an iron fist. But I got to maintain, my committee positions, my committees, I should say that. I'm being premature here. And so I started realizing, though, that my bill was being cut away. It was being grooverized. And I was being asked to carry a shell of a bill on to probably its death, because it would have been nothing that anybody wanted. But I started realizing, and you have to know, Bob, I didn't pass this ethics bill myself. I couldn't. I constitutionally couldn't have passed it myself. It took a majority of the legislature to pass it. And I started seeing my colleagues, my friends that I came in with as freshmen, some people who had not always been up front on bills before, but other people who had witnessed the excesses that I had witnessed, but they had just been quiet about it. And now they were kind of inspired, and they wanted to restore some of the things that had been stripped away in the Judiciary Committee. And Bobby Lawson from Gainesville, Tom Bordeaux from Savannah, Republican Max Davis from Atlanta, and others were very helpful in restoring things to the bill. Well, and it passed judiciary. Well, Denny Groover was so mad at me, he moved for passage of his bill as well. But ultimately, I think just because of the pressure the paper was putting on, they decided to run with mine. Well, I got it through rules, which was a tough barrier, but I was told the only reason you can get it through rules is if you do not agree to any amendments on the House floor. Well, here were people that my friends and colleagues that were not on Judiciary Committee, who had read about all the stripping down that the bill had endured, and they were embarrassed. They didn't want to pass a skeleton. Even if it was going to go to conference committee later, they wanted the House version to be strong. And so, but here I was with this obligation to not agree to amendments. So I kind of violated a code, I guess, of operations, but technically I was true to my word. What would happen through the parliamentary inquiry of the bill, we'd be there, and I'd say, please pass my bill, and the chairman would say, this is a good bill, please pass it. Well, then all my friends would stand up and they'd say, well, look, I moved to restore this language that was in the original bill. So there were all these handwritten and typed out amendments that were good amendments. And so I would say, parliamentary inquiry, everybody wants to hear from the author of what the author thinks, but you can't just say what you think, you have to ask it in. I always tell school kids it was like playing Jeopardy all the time. You have to ask everything in the form of a question. So I would say, isn't it true, Mr. Speaker, that this is a wonderful amendment, but I'm obligated to a deal that I cut that I can't agree to amendments? Well, that infuriated them. But amendment after amendment after amendment passed and got restored to the bill. So it was a fairly good bill that passed the House. But I was completely without a country at that point, because Denny Groover was furious and the Speaker was furious. Well, normally the Senate, passed, I went over and worked in the Senate committees, and they passed a much stronger version of the bill than even the House did. And normally the bill's author gets to be one of the conferees. Well, I had enough of playing a role of my own bill's weakening or ultimate destruction. So I wrote the Speaker a letter, and I think it says probably something you'd already planned already, but I don't care to be on the conference committee for my bill. And I basically said I support the Senate version more than the House, and it wouldn't be a true legislative conference committee if I was on the House team. But I did that for another reason. For one, it put the entire pressure. I think they would have liked me to been there, and they could have put pressure on me. We'll give you a welcome center back. We'll do a number of other things. Just help us come out with a so-so bill. I didn't want to do that, and I just, I'd been cussed out enough about the way I'd handled the thing on the floor that I just thought, well, let's just let the whole world come down on them if they don't pass a good bill. And lo and behold, they did. And in the 11th hour of the last day of the 1992 session, my bill came through as a conference committee that the Senate had passed, and the House passed it. And I guess it is the proudest work I ever did in the legislature, because it was a game changer. It forever, lobbyists had to register. They had to report everything that had ever happened, and in terms of what they gave to legislators. Well, and Zell Miller came through and funded the design for the Catoosa County Welcome Center. So it was a plus all around, and I'll always appreciate him for that. Now, the end of the 92 session, I knew that things were not going to be the same for me, but there were enough people out there who were just upset at the way everything had gone down, embarrassed at the way the leadership kind of seemed to bungle it and completely misread what the public wanted. And so some of us approached Dubose Porter and said, all of us are young, and all of us have just been here, a few days. You're the governor's floor leader. What if we tried to get you elected as Speaker? We felt a real groundswell out there in the state from the reaction to the ethics bill and the reaction to our leadership's blocking or attempts to block the ethics bill. And it took some talking to DuBose, but he thought, well, I'll do it. I'll try to do it. And it was very clear, and probably to his detriment, that I was the most outspoken advocate for DuBose. And I really was. And I made it my pledge to myself, because I always liked Tom Murphy. So I was not going to get personal about it. And I just said, it's just time for change. Well, Ray Holland, who I told you was kind of the intellectual of our bunch, he came up with a document that we called the Holland Manifesto. And it was basically a bill of particulars of everything we thought was wrong with our body and the way we did business in the legislature. We called for a ethics committee for us to police our own, the establishment of that. We called for pre-filing of bills so that people could pre-file them even, the summer before the next legislative term, and have study committees and have public hearings and, involve the public in things, except for this 40-day madness that we always did. And we asked for computerization of information, and so that we could all have access to it. And we asked for computers on the House floor, or the ability to get access, just so that we don't have to, on last-minute things, we would like to have our own sources of information other than what the lobbyist out in the hallway was sending in through their legislator. So the brilliance of Speaker Murphy was, and I'll always admire him for this, and I've always said he deserves one of the biggest statues out on the Capitol ground. I will say that to this day, because he did remarkable things, and he stopped a lot of bad legislation over the years. So I'll always want to honor him in that respect. But things started getting nasty at this point at the Capitol. And basically, he co-opted a lot of our ideas, which was fine. I mean, he created a health ethics committee. They came up with their own pre-filing of bills that they started doing, and all of this was from the Holland Manifesto, all from the group after we lost the speaker's race, running on these issues. I decided we should. I'd looked at the old Al Burris case. When Al Burris challenged Speaker Murphy and the group of people that kind of supported Al Burris, it was literal political obliteration. Al Burris spent the rest of his career trying to come back, trying to build back. And I saw that as not a good role model for me, and I didn't think for any of us. So I thought we should form a group called the Democratic Reform Caucus. Now, the difference between our time and Al Burris's time also was there were more Republicans now. Suddenly, the Speaker is 20-something votes away from losing the House. So he couldn't afford to alienate all of us, even the rebels. So they picked out just one person to punish. And you're looking at him. I got the punishment from on high. I got stripped of my committee assignments. Some of our rebels actually got new committees to head. DuBose did a wonderful job at rehabilitating his in-house politics, but there had to be a sacrificial lamb, and I guess I deserved it because I was the most outspoken of all of them. So, and I knew how it worked, so I wasn't personally upset. I just thought, well, this is just the way it works. Well, the 1993 session.
All right, guys, let's take a break there.
Okay.
Good. You're doing great.
All right. We're going to get really interesting stuff now.
Yeah, boy.
Well, the 1993 session was, of course, the session that Speaker Murphy was reinstalled. There was some talk of cutting a deal with the Republicans, and DuBose wanted nothing of it. I think that he wanted to start rehabilitating himself. I was, of course, my personal situation was different, and I thought, well, what would it hurt? What would it hurt to do a little power sharing right now, because they're coming on pretty strong. We're all going to want them to be kinder to us than they have been dealt with over the years, and so it might be good to have a bit of a transitional government, but nobody else really wanted to do anything with that. And that, again, was the brilliance of Tom Murphy, because, like I said, some of the rebels came out pretty good. They got some good committee assignments and got good treatment, but they had to have the sacrificial lamb, and that was me, and that was fine. But the Democratic Reform Caucus, we watched closely what was going on, and we continued to try to change things. And Dick Pettis with the Associated Press discovered what was popularly called a slush fund that House leadership was controlling out of state money. And it was of questionable legality as far as the process goes, but it was a certainly powerful tool that they could work and reward with. Now, a funny story, if I can, I've been speaking chronologically, but I've got to go back. When my little group of that you call the Four Horsemen, when we were freshmen, we were such eager students of the process that we would show up at the Appropriations Committee meetings. We would just sit there and listen, soak it all in. This is how they do it. This is how they work. Well, I was dating a little girl from Ringgold that was going to college down in Atlanta, and we'd quit dating, but we were still friends. We grew up in the same town, and so there she was, kind of being one of the hangers-on too at the process. So we get to what they call the Green Door Committee. And so we're all showing up ready to follow them in through the green door, and they just kind of laughed and said, well, whoa, nobody comes past this. Nobody comes past this. This is a kind of a real closed-door session thing. I'll never forget, the old girl I dated got to go in the Green Door Committee, and the guy who got elected by 44,000 Georgians didn't. So there were some memories of reform, budget reform that we had, and we introduced a measure as the Reform Caucus to straighten it out. Now, the leadership was embarrassed by this slush fund discovery, so they really couldn't do much about it other than swallow hard and pass our bill. So we were very excited. So at the end of the 93 session, we had survived the speaker's race. We had been obliterated, beaten pretty badly. The speaker can count numbers, and he had the power to make the promises to keep the power. But we had survived. We had created this Democratic Reform Caucus. We had passed reform legislation again, this time the Slush Fund Budget Reform Act. And so imagine my surprise in the summer when I in my office get a call from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. And he said, Representative Poston introduced himself, and I said, yes, sir, what's happening? You always kind of get a lump in your throat when the GBI calls you. He said, did you observe anything unusual on the last night of the legislative session, this last one? And I remember somewhat sarcastically saying, yeah, we passed a budget reform bill. That was the most unusual thing that I ever saw. And so he said, no, this is more unusual than that. So I asked him, what are you talking about? He said, well, there was a young man serving as a page who reports that over in your section, Section A, which was one of the smaller little sections just to the right of the speaker's platform. I always thought the speaker wanted to keep me close where he could watch me, but he said there was a young boy working as a page who says that a member flashed a kind of a phallic toy at him. And I was just stunned. And I said, but you have no idea who it is. And he said, no, that's why I'm calling you. We're trying to see who saw something different. I said, well, are you learning anything? He said, not much. And I said, is this publicly known? He said, oh, no, this isn't publicly known. So between hanging up with him and my next call, I realized that if things aren't publicly known around there, somebody else is going to be assigned as the purveyor of the sex toy. And I wasn't going to let that happen. I was the most unpopular guy there at that time. There were active candidate recruitment campaigns coming out of the Speaker's office for my seat. And so the very next call I made was to Dick Pettis at AP. And I said, guess what? And he of course ran with it. And we had the absolute first case for the new House Ethics Committee. And I filed a complaint. I didn't have any idea who did it, but I filed a complaint saying, you know, we really need to fully investigate this and find out what happened and do what we need to do. Well, that was, as someone said, now my fight had started involving non-combatants, and I was just, you know, being a rebel for the sake of being a rebel. But at the same time, I felt a little bit of self-preservation here, because if you don't solve who did it, you know, I'm going to be accused of it, or something, you know, somebody like that. The rumor that's going to go out and about is going to be that. Well, it ended up, of course, being the chairman of the Transportation Committee. So you can imagine how I swallowed hard and said goodbye to the last road paving that I'll ever see when that happened. But I could not resist when the reporter called me and said, well, it's the chairman of the Transportation Committee. It was given to him. He's saying it was given to him by a lobbyist. And my response was, well, I wonder if he reported that thing on the new Lobbyist Disclosure Act that I passed 2 years ago. Well, the poor lobbyist had to go back and amend his report to put this fake penis on his report that he gave as a gift. And so I guess I became the point person then for anybody that had a problem with the leadership, because the next thing that happened, and this was the furthest thing out of my business. I think I had a personal reason to bring the sex toy complaint, because I was concerned it happened in my section. If it's not solved, you know, there's going to be rumors started about it. The next one I had probably the least reason to file. But I was just mad as hell because they were recruiting a candidate against me. And I, you know, as Zell Miller's often said about the mountains, you don't put us in a corner. And a young lawyer who was a special attorney general by assignment over in Bremen, Haralson County area, had put one of the Speaker's clients on the child abuse registry, one of his law clients. And the Speaker, and this is unrefuted, the Speaker told her that if she didn't get his client's name off the child abuse registry, he's going to cut the funding for her entire agency that supported her and the Department of Family and Children Services. And of course, this woman was very upset, but she could find very little recourse. And of course, I file another ethics complaint. And like I said, I probably was less enthusiastic about that one, but I was just mad as hell. And I realized from the Burris example that to tuck your tail and try to get along was not an option, because you weren't going to get anything anyway. So as long as I was punching them, I was relevant, and I was continuing to make some impact. Well, that case went away faster than anything. The House Ethics Committee, which the Speaker loaded up with his own people, took no evidence, didn't even give the woman a chance to talk. Murphy didn't even appear, and they dismissed it. Now, the sex toy thing was something completely different. That had enough like I always call it jet fuel to it, that nobody was going to be able to just suppress that. It involved a child. It turned out that the mother had called the Speaker's office 2 days after it happened, and nothing had ever been done. And then she later said she had actually talked to the Speaker about it about 2 months before I broke the story. And so they had their problems. And so ultimately the chairman was publicly reprimanded in a session that was probably the most painful session I've ever sat through in the legislature, because he got a standing ovation. And then for the next 2 hours, people just took turns at the well giving me hell. And how in the world I could do that to a friend and a colleague, and how in the world could I? And I couldn't believe it. And to the chairman's credit, it was pretty well known in the House that he was not the one who brandished it. He was seen as the one who brought it to the floor, but he was not the one who, likely not the one who showed it to the child. And yet the brotherhood of the legislature, the fraternal atmosphere, caused him to take the fall and not include anybody else. And that was obviously a lesson that I never learned, was the brotherhood and the fraternal atmosphere. And so I caught a lot of heck about that. Well, the next session, of course, this all happened in the '94 session, and Brian Hicks, who was a reporter for the Chattanooga Times, he told me off the record, he said, I just had an off-the-record conversation with Tom Murphy, and he tells me you're not going to pass a bill this year. And I said, oh, so he's threatened it? He goes, oh, no, you know how he is. He's more subtle than that. He said, I'm not stopping him from passing a bill. The members just don't like him. They're not going to, they've told me they're not going to let one bill out. Well, I had about 5 things I wanted to do, various things, and I had other ways of getting 4 of them done. I had vehicles, we called them, that I could plug my language into another bill, or maybe over in the Senate side, and nobody would ever see my name on it, and it would pass, and they did. But I had one bill I couldn't find a vehicle for. And a constituent who was a little girl in a wheelchair, her parents had asked me to get involved. She was getting a dog trained to help her.
Susie.
You know Susie.
Yeah.
You remember Susie.
I remember Susie.
Well, these assistant dogs are great. They help people with wheelchairs. They can open refrigerators. They can, I don't know how, but they can push an elevator button, and I don't know if they can know which floor to push, but they can at least push one of them. And they can do absolutely amazing things. And I was given a demonstration, and I thought, well, this is amazing, and yes, I will introduce this bill. But I told this group of advocates, I said, maybe I'm not your best person. You know, I've kind of stepped on some toes down there. I said, no, you're our guy. Let's do it. And so we introduced this, and it had probably the most enthusiastic constituency of anybody I've ever seen. Now, my bill, it was already allowed for trained dogs, certified assistance dogs, to come into public places. What the bill was about was to let dogs in training by a certified trainer also go to public places, because they said, you know, you can train a dog forever and he's not going to be ready for a MARTA station. And you know, even those new trained dogs are going to go to MARTA stations, they're going to be a little freaked out, because here comes that train whooshing through and there's a big drop off, and we really need to train them at places like that. So all the advocates who were already at the Capitol, their dogs were already trained and certified, but they were just excited about the measure. So I started to realize that this was really breaking down a lot of the members' resolve that I was not going to pass the bill. And of course it wasn't their resolve, it was the Speaker's resolve. And so it got put in like 2 subcommittees levels of hell. And you know, I would show up and there'd be 5 or 6 people in their wheelchairs and their dogs, and the dogs are all well behaved. They're not scratching or, you know, using the bathroom on the floor. They're all perfectly behaved. And the subcommittee would say, well, gosh, yeah, we can't stop this. Yeah, we'll move it up. Well, it kind of got delayed enough to where it only got out of committee by the time the rules calendar kicked in, the one committee that Tom Murphy could control. So I would show up, and Bill Lee, the chairman of rules, he pulls me off to the side and he said, "I really wish you wouldn't bring all these people." And I said, "Well, what do you mean? They're just here for bills like everybody else. Look at all these people lining the walls. There's everybody you could think of, lines the walls." And, Bill kind of ran the Rules Committee with kind of a lighthearted, comical approach. It was disarming in a lot of ways, and it served a good purpose because there's so much seriousness there that it, I wasn't necessarily against his style. But he said, "You're trying to make us feel bad." And I said, "Well, I'm not trying to make you feel bad, but I'll talk to the group, and you have this committee in such a small room. I'll talk to the group, and maybe they can just designate one advocate a day to come with me." And I did that out of respect for the chairman, and I went out and told the group, I said, "Here's what he said. You're all trying to make us feel bad there in your wheelchairs and your dogs, just making us feel terrible. So why don't you just pick an advocate a day, and we'll continue asking for this bill to come out." And we did. Well, finally, some of the members of the Rules Committee, they just could not take it anymore. And somebody said, and Bill Lee was not chairing it, Denny Groover was chairing it, and because he was the vice chair. And he made a mistake that day. He made a statement that he sincerely apologized to me for yesterday. Not yesterday. Gosh, this is how many years ago. He sincerely apologized to me about it the next day. But he just got caught up in the moment. What he didn't realize was there was a group of school children there. There were reporters from Columbus, that a couple of the key legislators were from Columbus, Calvin Smyre and Tom Buck. And somebody said, "Why don't we let Poston's bill on? He and those people have been here every day." And then he said, "Those people are handicapped enough without Poston's help." And it blew up on him. It was a comment that probably we've all made insensitive comments in our careers and our lives, but it was just the worst time to make it. And it became fodder for the press. And he came to me the next day and he said, I didn't mean that the way it sounded." He said, "I'm really sick and tired of this thing between you and Tom Murphy." He said, "You come tomorrow, I'm going to get your bill out of committee." And he kept to his word. The next day, and I'll always admire him for that, he was the one who had been around long enough that he didn't have to take the speaker's mandates all the time. And he got my bill out. Now, that day that the bill got out of committee, the advocate of the day, since I had made the group come down to one, was a little boy, 12 years old, named David Zero. And David had been in a wheelchair all his life. And his dog Susie was this black lab who was just a beautiful dog. And I just turned to him. He was about the right age. I said, "Hey, why don't you be my page tomorrow when this bill comes out? And you people can kind of see how Susie helps you." And I meant just be a page, and they'll see the dog helping him all through the day. Well, I got so excited, and I really didn't think, well, we're just about to, if it passes, which how could it not pass, we're about to go over Tom Murphy's mandate. But I didn't think of it that much. I was just excited to have the bill up the next day, and it was a great bill. Well, the next day, I'm sitting in my chair getting ready, and Butch Benefield, the Speaker's Sergeant at Arms, he was a state trooper, a really nice guy who was kind of the bodyguard for the Speaker. He came up and he said, "I'm sorry, your boy and the dog can't get in." And I said, "What do you mean? Is there a problem?" He said, "Well, the Speaker says they can't get in." Well, the Speaker and I had not spoken that session, and I regret that, because up to that point I had always gone in and told him my views on things and told him why I was doing things. But it had gotten personal. And between all the ethics complaints and the getting opponents for me and all this stuff, we had just worn each other out in whatever. So I finally went up to him. He was up on the bench, and I said, "Mr. Speaker, what's going on with my page?" And he says, "You're trying to make us feel bad." I said, "I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad. I'm trying to make these people that need this law passed feel good." And he says, "Well, they can't get through the aisles." Well, right as he was telling me that, John Sherrick with Channel 11, I didn't plan it because I just walked straight up from Butch Benefield to the Speaker, so he knows I didn't plan it. John's behind me, and he said, "Hey, Poston, we want to do a story about your boy and the dog." And I said, "Well, talk to him because he won't let him on the floor." And I walked off, and I saw those lights come on, and I saw the Speaker who would he would kind of rock back and forth and kind of rub his whole face with his hand, and I knew it had just blown up on him. But I didn't hear what he said. And so my bill came up. The Speaker relented, let the boy and the dog on the floor. I didn't plan on the boy doing a demonstration, but he wheeled down and turned around, and he dropped an envelope down on the ground out of his pocket. He had a little sports coat on. And the dog went down and put its paw on the end of the envelope, made the other end stand up, grabbed the upward end with his teeth and laid it on the boy's lap. And God, we had people crying in the aisles and cheering and standing up. And I turned around, and there wasn't a soul in the Speaker's chair. And I thought, well, it's maybe this is over with. Maybe it's finally over with. But to my chagrin, it was not. I didn't even watch the news story that night. I came the next morning, and Sherrick came up kind of ashen-faced, and he said, "I just got told by the Speaker's office that if I do one more story on you, I'll never get a story again." I said, "Well, what did you do? What did you say? What did he say?" And he said, "You didn't see it?" I said, "No." So I left and went down to the House Information Office and asked them to run me that story. Well, it was awful. And it was the Speaker in his own words, just doing himself in, trying to explain why he was banning this child and the dog from the floor. And this thing, one thing you don't do, W.C. Fields says you don't work with children or animals. It just was hard to explain how you could ban that child, especially after the child's performance. So I thought, oh well, that's too bad, and maybe that's over with. But unfortunately, I heard someone say, the gentleman from Harrelson wants a point of personal privilege. So he went to the well, and the place was just completely silent. And of course, I'm in the last seat on the front row of the right side, so when I turn my seat, I pretty much can see everybody looking at me. And the Speaker breaks down and cries and sobs. And I couldn't believe it. And I could not believe what I was hearing. And he was crying and saying how he was misunderstood. And if that Neil Bortz were here, he would bash his brains in. And I was thinking, oh gosh, what's for me, And he went on and on about how he talked about his brother who was disabled and how he couldn't believe people would say he was not kind to the disabled or didn't understand the disabled. And I had heard about his brother, and I knew the Speaker was a very good advocate for the disabled. But he obviously didn't realize what it looked like to try to punish me in that context with the boy and the dog. But he wasn't going to say that either. He wasn't going to say, I was just punishing Poston, because that was something he would never say. And so the one thing he did was he said, well, I hope that Mr. Poston will come up here and explain that it just wasn't like that. Well, I was told later that that was my last opportunity to come up and basically get a little bit under the wings a little bit, maybe just a little bit under the fold, maybe not be put off in Siberia so much. And I could not do it. I did go up and spent the moment of my personal privilege thanking everyone for making it such a great day for David Zero, because his parents had told me that it was the most excited he had ever been about anything. They said that, I asked, doesn't he go to school? And they said, yeah, but he's so into this legislative process, we're all for him coming here as much as he wants to. And that's all I said. And Ray Holland later told me that he said, you missed a real good opportunity. The speaker was needing a lifeline, and you could have thrown him one, but you didn't. But later that year, he lined me up some opposition. And in April, after the session, the former tax commissioner comes down, escorted by Bob Peters, the guy I'd beaten years before, and helping him sign up to run against me. So I knew that was directly from the Speaker's office. Well, we had passed a drug test law that all the legislators we felt we needed to do as well. But obviously, while the state employees got theirs randomly, we knew we got ours right before qualifying. And we had to qualify within a certain number of days of that drug test being made, or otherwise it's stale. So we were all, getting ready to do our drug test. And I'll always remember a funny story that I'll let Representative Ray Holland tell you about that day. But we all show up, and then, of course, we all go and see who our opponents are, those that drew opponents. Not many of us did, but I did. And my opponent, aided by my predecessor, signed up to run for State House District 2. Well, that was the number of the district when I came in, but reapportionment had changed it to District 3. So they signed up for the wrong district. And, of course, when I saw the printout of who all had run, and Mike Snow's calling me saying, who is this guy and why is he running against me? I said, it's a mistake. I'm sure they'll correct it. And sure enough, they corrected it. Well, they corrected it the next, that was on a Monday. They corrected it on a Wednesday and signed up for District 3, but the gentleman had put the wrong precinct down. Now, that was not a fatal error. But I went up to the courthouse in Ringgold, and I was laughing about the first mistake, and I planted in the ears of a few people that I knew would go blab it immediately that he had made another mistake, that he had put down the wrong precinct that he lives in, and I was going to disqualify him. Well, he ran as fast as he could down to Atlanta on Friday to qualify a third time for the same race, but this time his drug test was out of date, because his drug test had expired. So he qualified the last time without a drug test, and I got him disqualified. so that was basically the end of my troubles with the Speaker. We had done battle, and we had done battle fiercely, and we had given each other our best shots, but we were both standing. And in a strange way, we started getting along again. Mm-hmm. And I left 2 years later and ran for U.S. Congress, and it was a failed bid, but I knew I had done about as much as I could do at the state capitol, and I was leaving on my own terms, which was important to me, and I wanted to either do this on a full-time basis or get out of it. Mm-hmm. And I let the voters decide, and they sent me home to Ringgold from the congressional race.
It was generally known, though, at that time that the Speaker supported you for Congress, did he not?
Yeah, he did. Mm-hmm. He did. And more than I would have ever dreamed that he would have. Mm-hmm. And I've talked with him in later years. And again, like I said, even in the fiercest of battles, and even when I was trying to have him sanctioned and removed, I still think he deserves one of the biggest monuments there because of what he represented, the period he represented, and the progress that the state made while he was Speaker. Mm-hmm. I just don't think that everybody should be in those positions forever. And the brilliance of the man is that he passed just about all of our reforms. What you see in the House now, Tom Murphy heralded in, not his successors. The computerization, the pre-filing of bills, and if anything, I think, quite frankly, there's been almost a step backwards. The Speaker was fair. When you got a committee, you kept it. I know that there were people on Judiciary that were dying that I was there when I was in the middle of throwing all those Molotov cocktails, but he left me on it because he was a man who made a principled rule, seniority and this, that, and the other, and he generally stuck to it because he knew that things would start unraveling if he started picking it here or there. But it was fascinating to me as a leadership style how he would never directly tell somebody to do something. Mm-hmm. He would just tell them what he thought about it, what his concerns about it were, and generally people got the idea and scrambled around. And
there's one bill that I recall that you championed that is now law in Georgia, but it took all these years. Is your idea about an inspector general?
Well, I actually, of course, that was one that I did not pass myself, but I was the first one to bring it up. I also separated the heads of Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Division. It was an unusual arrangement, and with my toxic waste facility about to happen in Catoosa, I realized that the same person that's supposed to be protecting the environment was the person that was issuing permits for these facilities. And I wrote to Jimmy Carter, and I'll always be proud of this, and I have it framed in my office. I wrote him a letter telling him that I was trying to change this, and I looked back in history at when they merged together, when they were put together, and I suspect that it might have been put together for a personality of that day that President Carter, then Governor Carter, trusted, and likely just created that position for him. And he wrote in the margins of my letter that I was right, and he mentioned the guy's name and said, yes, this is why I put these two together, but basically gave me his blessings to undo it. And I basically infiltrated every gubernatorial debate and planted that question to give the false sense that this was something of great statewide concern. And Zell Miller, to his credit, he pledged that he would look into it and change it, and he did. And so I was very proud of that. I did, after the Ethics Act, when things were a lot tougher to do, I passed the statewide Whistleblower Act that protects state employees for blowing the whistle on fraud and abuse and theft of state funds and services. And then my last year there, a pesticide notice act for people who are sensitive to pesticides, for example, in dorm rooms. Sometimes you're supposed to post notice, so those who are sensitive could look out for the notice and just avoid their room for a while, or even get out for a while if they worked in an office and they had some sensitivities.
Well, now let's turn to your legal career.
Well, I was kind of a bit of a drift, to tell you the truth, after losing the congressional race, even though I should have been more prepared to lose it. I had.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. That was an unusual election in that the incumbent had switched parties.
The incumbent had switched parties. He obviously read the tea leaves. I could never do that. And so it was an opening. It was an opening, and I had already decided I need a heads-up way to leave here in the State House. Tom Murphy didn't run me off. Nobody beat me here. They tried to beat me back home. They tried to beat me at the Capitol, and they didn't. So here's a heads-up way that I can leave. I was none too happy with the incumbent because he had just used a lot of our goodwill and treasure to get himself elected. And then this was, however, the time of the Gingrich revolution, and he said, Congressman Deal said that he could do more in the majority party than he could in the minority party. So I'm always curious what he's saying now that the Democrats have taken over again. And I understand he's running for governor now, so maybe that's his way of getting out himself. But it was a different animal than, as you can imagine, a state house race. No longer, I wanted to do it right. I hired all the professionals. They put me in a padded room with a telephone and a list, and I very uncomfortably raised $500,000, which was apparently something that most challengers didn't do. But it was it was not at all pleasant. I didn't really get to do the door-to-door and get to know people like I had done in the district, but had, as Zell Miller taught us all, the modern campaign is more of a, it's not necessarily the country store anymore. Mm-hmm. But yet I launched my campaign from the Graysville Mercantile, which I was very proud of. Both brothers are passed away now, and my dad passed away in July of this year, and he was my sign man in all of my elections. He got out and put up signs, and I was always very happy that he and I had that time. But it was just a completely different animal. The funny thing about it was my wife that I had married at the Capitol, she could not stand Ringgold, and she really probably wasn't really liking me anymore, and suddenly we were going to be in Ringgold together, and she really wanted to move on with her career, and she found a job in Chicago. Unfortunately, she found it in the middle of my congressional race. And so with my blessings, she left, and so I had the amazing absent spouse throughout this congressional race. Well, campaign staffs are kind of notorious about communicating with each other and teasing each other. Well, Deal's staff would call my staff and they'd say, "Where'd he put the body?" And so it was just completely, embarrassing. Nothing public was out, but it was fairly well known that I was going through a divorce right in the middle of a congressional race. And so it was kind of merciful at the end of the congressional race to go ahead and do that. So I was trying to somewhat reinvent myself as a lawyer, which I had never really done full-time ever. I'd been a prosecutor briefly, and I'd always dabbled in politics the rest of the time. So I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do and where I wanted to do it. And in 1997, not quite a year after the congressional race is over, I was just walking to the courthouse one day, and I had heard that there was a strange discovery of a woman's body in a man's house in Ringgold, and he claimed it was his wife, and nobody in town really knew that he had a wife, and didn't recognize her, didn't know, and they surmised that he had kept her there for like 30 years. And so I knew this guy because he had gone to high school with my oldest sister, and he was odd acting, very sinister acting, and kind of scared people. He had a little TV shop in town that he had shuttered in the early 80s, and he had some theory that the sheriff had put him out of business, and he had even run for sheriff in '84, and it was all considered somewhat of a joke. But he was very sincere and always wanted to talk about how he had been done wrong, but nobody knew he had a wife. And so he would catch me at the same corner of sidewalk and street every day. No matter what time I left, I would see him walking from a phone booth, and he would encounter me. And first couple of days, it was just he would nod, and the second couple of days, he would grumble something, and finally I just said, "Mr. Ridley, I know who you are. How are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, I'm not doing any good. They're saying I killed my wife." And just the memory of my congressional race was so fresh on my mind, I said, "Well, I know exactly how you feel." And he looked up at me as if he had just found his lawyer. And so he started, in his own way, he was the most difficult client I have ever had. I hadn't had many clients up to that point, but he is the most difficult client I have ever had and probably will ever have. He suffered from a paranoid condition that would not allow him to trust me, yet he needed me. He lived in poverty. There was this shackled building that he owned that had a bunch of 1970s console TV sets in them that had the last high water mark from the last flood we had on them, and the roof was falling in. And his house looked like a fortress. It was all kind of fences and things like that on the side that you could see from the street. And I thought, well, this poor guy, he doesn't have anything. That was before we had the public defender system. So I walked him over to the judge's office and I said, Judge, to Judge Van Pelt, I said, Judge, this is Mr. Ridley. He's charged with killing his wife and holding her hostage in the house for 30 years. And he needs a lawyer. And the judge says, well, the sheriff's already called me about him. He owns a $500,000 piece of property up on the lake in Chattanooga. And I looked at him and he looked at me and he said, well, that's Mom and Daddy's property. They'd never want me to sell that. And I thought, man, this guy's somewhat of a mystery. So he and I came to terms that I would represent him. But it was like pulling teeth to get him to even come to my office. So I decided, to me, this case was important because I was no longer doing public work and I had just lost this congressional race and I really wanted to win something. And I told him, I said, I really want to win your case. I think you've got a good case. And I was thinking in terms of the state can't prove you did this. In the back of my mind, I was thinking, well, did he do it? And I'm not sure, but I don't think the state can necessarily prove it. Well, he wouldn't let me go into his house. He would miss appointments. It was driving me crazy. So I finally had decided he would call me from phone booths in the middle of the night, screaming at me why I hadn't knocked the case out yet. That's the way he put it. And so finally I said, you've got to come to my office. I just screamed back at him. And he would get calm. And so ultimately when I finally got him to come to my office, I told him, I'm going to put a phone back into your house. Your phone's been cut off. I'm going to pay for it and have it put back in the house. And that way you and I can communicate. And he agreed. And yet he still wouldn't let me in the house. Now, he had let the sheriff's deputies and investigators go in every time they wanted to, but he wouldn't let his own lawyer. So finally, I got the case put off because I just didn't have anything. I got it put off from the September term, and Thanksgiving came along, and I'd gone to my parents' house up in Graysville, and my mother, they remembered him. My dad had bought Zenith television sets from him. And my mother said, why don't you take Alvin Ridley something? We know he's alone now, and why don't you take him something? And it was that gesture, that me showing up at his house, and while there was this huge barricaded, giant 10-foot tall fence on one side, on the other side there was one strand of turned off electric fence that was laying on the ground. So it wasn't like a real fortress at all. It just looked like one. I showed up at the door with that, and he was so touched by the gesture, he invited me in. Well, it was the most bizarre, uncomfortable house I'd ever been in. It was just a very poor house. It smelled awful. It had was in poor condition. But the guy was also quite a pack rat. There was everything you can imagine in this house over the years, old things, televisions. I told him that I wanted to go back out to my car and get a camera because there were no locks on the windows, there were no locks on the doors. There was nothing that would make you think that this woman was held there. So I went into every room but one, and he said, you can't go in there. That's Mama's room. So I'd say, well, I need to get photos of every room. but I'll respect your wishes right now. But what I did find on the wall was a shrine of sorts that he had put of poems and letters and things that his wife had written. She had a very distinctive hand, a handwriting that you could tell right away was the same person. Although ultimately I did get a scientist to confirm that. But she apparently had epilepsy. And one of a side condition that she had that I didn't even learn about until the eve of the trial was that some temporal lobe epilepsy patients who are not medicating have a condition called hypergraphia, where she was compelled to write everything she ever thought. And so in this house was 27 years of her writings. And I spent almost a week there every day over the holidays going through this stuff. And I found a notation, a journal entry, or something written that I could account for every month of 27 years. Either that she dated it or what she was talking about. Man landed on the moon today. Elvis's movie came out today. And I could date them by what she was talking about. She wrote 4 presidents. Now here's a woman that everybody in Ringgold is saying she's been held captive in her house, but she's writing presidents. She wrote Congressman Davis. She wrote all these people, and she shared the same kind of paranoid view that Alvin had, how everybody was against them and they needed help. And oddly enough, he thought and she thought that federal government was their salvation. They despised and suspected everybody in state government. Well, I learned, and it was somewhat inspiring to me, that I get a call from Nathan Deal, my former opponent, the congressman. And I thought, well, that's kind of nice, him calling me up. He's never done that before. It's a nice gesture. I wonder what it's about. I called him and he said, keep Alvin Ridley away from my congressional office. He's scaring the people down there. And so, knowing how Alvin was, that how he trusted federal government and hated state government, that was going to come as a big blow to him. But at the same time, I didn't want him arrested. So I kind of sat him down, a calm moment, and I said, Alvin, let me tell you about that Nathan Deal. I said, you know what I think about Nathan Deal, and I was just kind of boosting up. I didn't really think anything about Nathan Deal, but I was just trying to get him fired up that I was on his side. And I said, he says he doesn't want you at his congressional office anymore. I said, if you'll help me and help me help you win this trial, I'll tell you where he lives and you can go tell him about it. So that calmed him down. He was fine with that. But it also inspired me to work even harder for him. And I was paying money that I didn't have for experts. I hired this one expert that I didn't check out very closely, and it turned out he wasn't even licensed. But I wanted him to come see the house. And this was right before the trial. We were picking a jury, and there was a woman watching the trial who said in the paper, he's always been weird, talking about the defendant. He used to ride around town with a mannequin in his car, making us think he had a girlfriend. Well, I was incensed because all I needed was more weirdness about my client. And so I couldn't believe it. And I got this forensic pathologist guy, and I said, I want you to come over to his house and look at where the body was and kind of help me with my theory that she had a seizure and she suffocated herself. And I said, but I can't believe they're being so cruel to this guy. Well, Alvin was uncharacteristically excited about the forensic pathologist coming over. And I quit saying the term forensic pathologist because I would have to spell it for him every time. He'd pull his glasses out and pull some wad of paper out of his pocket. But he was so excited. Well, we're going in the house, and the place is very creepy, but I was used to it by then. And one room was illuminated by a little red Christmas light bulb. And that helped him find the string for the other light. And he said, I've got her here just like I found her. And he clicked it on, and there's an old mannequin from the 1950s laying in the bed. He has recreated the scene. And he pushes down on it, and its head falls off and lands on the forensic pathologist's foot, and he ran out of the door and never came back. And so I would tell him, we had motions. I filed more motions in that case than I'd ever filed before. And he was suggesting that I file other motions, such as, please make the government stop surveilling me from space. And so I would just humor him, and I'd file, please government, stop surveilling him, And he would sit there and nod his head. Well, he didn't show up for motions day. And Judge Van Pelt said, if you don't have him here by 1:30 after lunch, I'm going to put him back in jail. Well, I didn't know where he was. I was the only person he ever talked to. But I knew he went to the VA clinic up in Chattanooga, because I had taken him to the VA hospital one time because of his, he wore, for no apparent reason, he wore a neck brace. And he was saying he didn't have to go to court because his neck was hurt. So I was wanting to prove that his neck wasn't hurt. So I took him to the VA hospital, and this is probably an indictment of the old VA system. He was a veteran, so he qualified. And he came in and he said, they said, well, Mr. Ridley, what do you need? And I said, tell him, Alvin, tell him. He said, well, I was up on the roof, and a lot of his stories started off, I was up on the roof. He said, I was up on the roof, and the sheriff worried me by driving by and worried me off the roof, and I fell 2.5 stories and landed on my head. Well, without looking up, they said, well, we're going to give you some Tylenol and codeine. And I said, wait a minute, did you hear what the man said? He said the sheriff worried him off the roof, and he floated down and landed on his head, and you're about to give him medications? I said, give him a placebo and let us go see the psychological counselor. And Alvin said, don't give me any of those placebos. I hear they're habit forming. So got him back to a counselor. Anyway, he misses that court date. I found him at the VA hospital. And they said, yeah, he's here. He says a spider bit him. And so I go up to Chattanooga and I get him. And I said, you got to come with me or you're going to go to jail. So through lunch I got him, and I got him back. And I said, Judge, I got Mr. Ridley here. I guess we're ready to go through our motions. And he said, well, Mr. Ridley, why weren't you here? And Alvin said, well, I got a spider bite, Judge. And while I was, looking at the judge trying to wink or whatever, he raised his shirt, and he apparently had a grotesque bite wound on him. It was so bad that the judge said, that's okay, Mr. Ridley, you go home. And so we got our motions put off. But Alvin was such that he would tell me that the Constitution said he did not have to go to court. So I took to carrying a copy of the U.S. Constitution around with me. And every time he would say it, it would always be in the morning. And this was all throughout the trial. He would leave his door unlocked by then, and I would just go on in, and I'd say, Alvin, get out of bed. He'd be in bed covered all the way up to his neck. And he'd say, the Constitution says I don't have to go if I'm sick. And he'd be real frustrated. And I'd said, I brought it again. Tell me which article, which chapter. Tell me which place. And he says, well, it ought to say that. And I said, well, it doesn't, and they're going to put you in jail. We got to show up to win. I said, I feel real good about your case. Well, he'd pull the covers off, and he'd be fully dressed, shoes and everything. So he was just making me go through this ordeal to get him there, and hoping, I guess, I would say, okay, you don't have to go. Well, one day I asked the judge, well, what would it take in this motions hearing for him not to be here? And the judge said, well, he has to sign some waiver of his presence. So I told him, I said, Alvin, I'm excited. I got a way that you don't have to come to court next time. And he said, oh, yeah? And I said, yeah, you meet me at my office, 9 o'clock. So I stayed at my office, and I waited on him. He wasn't there, and I just kept improving the waiver, and even threw in a part about how he's satisfied with my representation. And he still never showed up. I tried calling him. The phone's busy. Well, let me take you back to the first day I went to the house. I had already gotten the state discovery, and the state discovery noted a period 6 years before where his state officials had come in to check on his elderly mother. And in reality, they were looking for the wife. The wife's family was constantly looking for her and sending state agents in to try to look for her, which increased his paranoia. But they noted that there were 2 cats tied to the coffee table. So, I just thought, well, that's kind of weird. Well, then I look at the coroner's report from '97, and they described this body laying in the bed, and then they said, and by the way, there are 2 cats tied to the coffee table. So I told him when I went in the house, I said, I could have the best case on you, but if any of my relatives get on this case and they think you're abusing these cats, you're going to be convicted just for that reason. Well, I made him untie the cats. And right before the trial, I told him, I said, we need to get these cats to the doctor to check them out, because the DA is trying to make a big deal over the fact that you tied these cats to the coffee table. And he said, well, Mama didn't want them having no babies. And they had a little litter box and a little bowl of water, but they were just tied with twine to the coffee table. So I took a little high school girl that worked for me, went over to his house to get him and the cats to take them to the vet. And I took him 2 big file boxes, and I sent him in with a file box, and I said, by the way, when these cats come out of the house, they better have some names. So he came out and he said, this one's Meowie. Mama named her Meowie. And he hands me a box, and I hand it to the little girl that came with us. And I didn't want her to go in the house. So he goes in to get the other cat, and I think I hear it, so I'm calling it under a table, and this rat about this big comes out and made me kind of scream, and the girl thought he was killing me inside the house, so she started screaming. Well, he came out with the other box, and he said something about, this is Kitty. So we went to the vet. I'd never seen the cats in the daylight. We went to the vet. The vet found that the cats were in good shape, but one of them was like 20 years old. Its upper fangs had grown down below its chin. It looked like some kind of saber-toothed cat, but the vet said that's not unusual for a really, really old cat. Well, the cats, the night I was trying to get him to come sign this waiver of his presence at the motions hearing, the phone was off the hook. Well, I finally went to his house, and I was scared to death, so I went ahead and called an ambulance. I figured either he's going to need an ambulance or I'm going to get shot trying to go to his house at night, and I'm going to need one close by. So I said, no police, please, just an ambulance. So I had 2 ambulance workers and an ambulance out in his driveway, and I beat on his door and kind of stepped back in case there was going to be any shooting. And he came to the door, and his hair was all disheveled. He's usually very clean cut. And he obviously had fallen asleep. And I said, Alvin, why in the world aren't you at my office signing this form? I was worried about you. And he said, well, I guess I fell asleep. And I said, well, why didn't you answer the phone? He said, well, since you made me untie them cats, they keep knocking the phone off the hook. So it was my fault. So ultimately, though, her writings vindicated him. But the interesting thing was he would not let me use them unless I agreed to let him control the evidence, which was a big compromise, because I was afraid he was not going to show up with it, and then I would have nothing. So when I'd get him every morning from home, he would load up these giant Samsonite suitcases, and we'd take them to the Catoosa County Courthouse, and we'd open them up. And one day he forgot his neck brace, so I sent my secretary to the medical supply store to give him another one. And there's no telling what the jury thought. See me right before jury selection putting a neck brace on him like I was trying to get their sympathy or something, but I was just trying to keep him calm. And he would open the suitcases, and I would get out the packets of her paperwork that I wanted to introduce. Well, the problem was that I would just say in the hundreds of cockroaches hitched a ride to the courtroom in his suitcases. And we infested the first courtroom in the Catoosa County Courthouse with cockroaches. And another media source interviewed the jurors one time, and they were talking about me trying to make a point, and then I would see a roach climbing up my tie, and I would flip it off and start stomping it. But that was the case. He ended up somewhat in his own way charming the jury. He and I had agreed that he was not to testify, but the last day before the end of the trial, I was the one day I thought he can eat lunch. He kind of started having a following of people that started realizing, well, maybe he's innocent. So I said, well, why don't you go eat lunch with your following there, and I'll just have a lunch without you. Well, that was the day Jesus showed up and told him he was to testify. So I told the judge I need an extra hour with him, and I told him about if he testified, all the things that could come out that I had successfully suppressed, like the cats being tied up and all these other things, that none of them incriminating, but just weird stuff that the DA was hoping to use against him, but that I had gotten suppressed. But he was intent, so I thought, well, I've had a year and a half trying to work with him. There's no way the DA can get anything out of him in a half a day. And it was somewhat of a comedy hearing the DA try to break him, because he just doesn't think the way we do, and he doesn't respond the way we do. So the jury acquitted him, and it was, like I said, the most challenging law case of my career in terms of a difficult client. I later had other challenging cases. One you mentioned, Bob, before we started was a fellow that we both knew in Georgia who was accused of going to Tennessee and killing his opponent in a state Senate race. And that was a difficult case. I learned that high-profile cases have their own levels of difficulty that are different than just a normal case. The fact that it's high-profile can make a prosecutor make completely different decisions. They probably are investigated better, and there's more government resources put into them because of the potential of the media involvement. That client was convicted. I was the 7th lawyer to try to represent him. He was very difficult, but someone that I remembered and knew from the legislature just as you did. And everything after that pretty much calmed down. I became a father, which is the best job I've ever had. I went through a divorce again, which is unfortunate, but I have my children half the time with me, and they are very special. They were born in the Republic of Kazakhstan. I adopted them at 8 months, 4 months, and 11 months old. They are now 9, 9, and 4, and Alina, Mac, and Cal, and they are the loves of my life. And they are one of the reasons I agreed to do this interview. So one day they can look at their old man and see some of the things that I was involved in. Mm-hmm. I guess I have to mention a huge case that I was involved in from 2002 on. As everyone knows, the whole country was just in this state of shock after September 11, 2001. And for weeks and months after that, there was a bit of almost a national depression, or just, again, shock and whatever. Well, in February of 2002, there was a discovery at an old rural crematory in Walker County of some bodies. and that were not cremated and not properly handled, not properly stored. And so from that day began, I guess, one of the biggest cases in Georgia. I know that it was the longest search warrant ever executed in Georgia's history of the property and the whole grounds. For 5 months, the government held the property. I remained on the sidelines for several days, curious about it, of course, and wondering which one of my colleagues was going to step up and represent the guy, but everybody seemed to be scrambling around for a piece of the civil action. And even I was starting to get some calls from people who thought they had a body there and wanted to know who they could sue and whatever. And I just remember being a little embarrassed that the guy was not represented. Again, we didn't have the public defender system in place, and he was just sitting in jail, and nobody was saying anything about him, and there were press conferences twice a day suddenly on CNN and everywhere. And a reporter from Chattanooga, who's no longer a reporter, and that's the only reason I'll say who it was, because he knew the family. I actually knew the family from Democratic politics. Clara Marsh was active in the Democratic Party in Walker County, a very fine woman who had been an educator all of her years and was retired and working kind of in the county office like a lot of retired educators end up. Her husband had started the crematory back in 1982, and quite frankly it was a remarkable thing for a success story for an African American in Northwest Georgia, which is so predominantly Caucasian, that here was a guy that had found a need and kind of built a small crematorium and was servicing these funeral homes throughout the area. And it was really kind of a shock to everybody. But I guess, like I said, more shocking to me was who's going to represent this guy. Well, my reporter friend called me and he said, I'm going to take off my reporter hat. I asked this family if they had a lawyer yet, and they wanted to know, would you at all be against talking to them about taking the case? And I said, well, not at all. And I remembered there was a book I had in college before law school, and it was by a gentleman who had been kind of an activist in the 60s, and he had gone on to be a lawyer and did some public defender work, and it was called How Do You Defend These People? And it was just basically a book about the Constitution and about why it's so important that people who are accused of doing the most heinous things, why it's even more important that they get representation, because it becomes symbolic of what the rest of the system is like, or what it can do. And so I'd already kind of pulled the book in case they did want to hire me, so I could explain it to my then wife, because she wasn't too pleased about me taking the case. The lady that cleaned our house called and cussed her out and said, I'm never going to clean your house again. And I just made an assumption and called her and I said, ma'am, I'm sorry, I didn't know you had a relative there. And she said, no, I didn't have a relative there. I just didn't think you'd represent that nigger. And so I knew it was important then that he have good representation. And I went and visited him in jail and filed a number of early motions, and ultimately they had him charged ultimately with 787 felony counts. He was looking at over 8,000 years of imprisonment, which I thought was excessive, but it was high profile. And as my theory goes, they're going to, throw everything at you when the cameras are rolling. So it took me 7 months to get him out of jail. Meanwhile, civil suits started happening. And I didn't know if they had insurance or not. The mother couldn't remember who her insurance was with on the family property or whether it would apply. And so I started handling defending civil suits. And I had my friend from the Looper case in Tennessee who practices law in California, Ron Cordova. I asked him, will you come in and help? Because I need somebody to handle these civil things until we find out who the insurance is with. And so we literally just about set aside everything else to do this. I went through 5 secretaries in 5 years of representing Ray Brent Marsh, who to this day is the nicest, kindest, most gentle person I have ever represented. I have a very strong theory of what happened there, regardless if people want to hear it or not. I suspected there might be some environmental issues there. His father became sick in 1996 and could just completely disabled with his illness. Strokes, neuropathy, all kinds of problems. The father died while I was representing them. Brent was charged with the mishandling of all the bodies, but there was a hue and cry for the rest of everybody's heads because the chief medical examiner made a really not well thought out comment early in the case that these bodies go back 20 years. He, for the rest of the case, regretted saying that because they didn't. They only went back 5 years. But because he said that, everybody thought, well, we can just be against the whole family. And how could they not have known about that on their property? That's another question everybody has. Well, first, this was 16 acres. Secondly, the Walker County Sheriff's Department inspected the property just 4 months before the discovery of the bodies, and they couldn't find one body. So it's not that far a stretch to think that the rest of the family did not know about it. And Brent said the rest of the family doesn't know about this. But he could never give a reason of why it happened. The bodies were not molested, they were not tampered with, they were not, as the rumor had it, posed in various poses around a card table or as the rumors were going crazy. So it just didn't make sense. So I had him tested, and the testing showed that mercury was just ravaging his toxicology makeup. And mercury, as you know, is a neurotoxin. The way it got into him and his father, I believe, was the venting from the old crematory. It was old, it was falling apart, it had holes in it, had rust. The way he described the process, his father and he would work over the years, either both of them or just his father or just him. And Brent cremated successfully 2/3 of the bodies that were sent to him in the 7 years that he ran the crematory, or 5 years that he ran the crematory. In Europe, in some places in Europe, the teeth, the mercury-filled fillings of teeth, the tooth has to be extracted before that body can be subjected to cremation. That's because you're putting a heavy metal into the atmosphere. Well, there's no such regulation in Georgia. This facility wasn't being regulated. And ironically, one of the things we did in the legislature was we basically grandfathered this one facility to keep them from having to be regulated for a short period of time, which is something that obviously none of us knew about it, but I voted for it too. It was just what a constituent, the way we looked after constituents, and who would ever imagine that this would ever happen. Well, the fact is, none of it had happened when we did that. Poor Mike Snow paid a dear price for being the sponsor of that, looking after his constituents. and nothing had gone wrong at that point when that was done. But there it was for all of us to be embarrassed by. But Brent, I think the neurotoxin mercury affected him mentally while it took another course on his father. His father died during the representation of multiple organ failure that was characteristic of mercury poisoning. You've heard the term Mad Hatter. Well, this comes from these Huguenot craftsmen a couple of hundred years ago who made hats, and they worked with mercury to, I guess, treat or adjust or make the hats more pliable or whatever. And many of them began to have deep psychological issues. And that was going to be our defense in the case. And I had scientific backing. I had a professor who was an expert in neurotoxins who was going to back us up. We did win a key pretrial appeal, and not really win it, but we got the Supreme Court to take it up. And that was the issue. Brent had been charged with felonies for stealing a body. Now, the delineation of felony and misdemeanor in Georgia is the amount of $500. So he only charged $250 for the cremation service that was not done. So that would have been a misdemeanor theft. The question was, by taking a body, how could that be a felony? What is a dead corpse worth? Well, believe it or not, there is case law on that from over 100 years ago, where someone was going to a funeral and the casket fell and there was the body fell out, and the court bestowed upon the nearest of kin a kind of a quasi-tort right. And they basically wrestle with that. Well, what's a body worth? What are these materials? It's not like pig iron. It's not like a commodity that can be exchanged. It's something that is rapidly going away. And so they agreed to take up that question. And once the Supreme Court agreed to take up that question, the district attorney got reasonable. And Brent wanted to stop his family from having to go through any more. And so he agreed to a sentence that he's serving now, the service part being 12 years, and then pretty much the rest of his life on probation, with some restrictions on, obviously he's not going to go in the crematory business anymore. But the point is, I was proud. It was an extremely stressful case, but I was proud to have worked it, because I thought it was important for my region, and I had children by then, and I wanted them to see that this man gets treated fairly, no matter what the color of his skin, no matter what how odd the case was. And the oddity of the case kind of ramped up the passion about it, and there were death threats. I was actually kind of hoping that the Klan would get involved so I could get a change of venue. And so I was kind of giving out every invitation for a threat from them, but the poor guy that ran the Klan, he was dying of cancer. And he didn't have the time to mess with us. But he did make a statement that I tried to use, and I got a partial change of venue victory. We were going to go down to Lee County and get a jury and then bring them back. But there was no way to win that case. The question got down to, how can I make this case so expensive for Walker County that they'll get reasonable? Because there's really no, other than the Mercury defense, we can't say that he didn't do it, or he didn't do it, I guess, in this case. But it was a very difficult case in that respect, and the family, of course, is recovering. I will say that there was a lot of, I've had the fortune to represent some pretty nice people in very difficult times in their lives, and I'm hoping that they feel that I helped them.
Looking back over your political and legal career, is there anything you might have done differently?
I can't say that. I'm a big believer that, even when bad things happen to you, they set you on a course that gets you to where you are today. Obviously, had I won the congressional race, I can't imagine the scenario in which I would be the father of my 3 children. Had I gone anywhere else of any of the other things I've tried and sometimes failed, and perhaps even the battles with Tom Murphy, had I gone along and, obviously if things were changing in Georgia anyway, so that course probably would not have turned out anything special. I would say that I'm a person of the time that I lived in, and those times affected my course. It would have been completely different 20 years before. In the first place, they could have really punished me and made it stick because, the Republicans didn't have enough numbers to be anything meaningful in those days. And, some of my Republican friends helped me out on this ethics bill, but some of my Democratic friends did too. And I thought it was, the fascinating thing, as much punishment and as hell as I was going through, a lot of their spouses, a lot of my colleagues' spouses would come up and say to me what their spouse couldn't get caught saying to me. And that is, we really like what you're doing. And keep at it, keep going. And so I had my inspiration, and I was not alone. Like I said, I could not have passed it alone. There were a lot of people that took a less high profile, but they were there at key times to offer those amendments to restore the bill to its full power, and who, did the right thing.
How would you like to be remembered?
Well, gosh, I hope I'm around a lot longer to influence that, but I would like my children to remember me as somebody who believed in this country, and not just its symbols, and not just its, not a big issue in the legislature when I was trying to do what I thought was real work. We would get completely distracted on the subject of what are we going to do about a person that burns the flag. I couldn't believe that we were stopping everything, debating what are we going to do about people that burn the flag. I'd never seen anybody that burned the flag. I'd seen it on TV. But, I want my children to realize that every government for hundreds of years has had a flag. It's just a piece of cloth. But what ours really stands for is the ability to take dissent to the point of making such profound public statements that it can be nauseating. But that's really what it stands for. And that's a hard thing to sell on the street, but it's very important for people to know.
Thank you for being our guest, McCracken Poston. You certainly had a very brilliant political career, if I may say, and you've certainly been a courageous member of the House of Representatives.
Thank you, Bob. It's been a real honor.